Well, I'm going to be reading something that no one here has read because it's an anthology that will be coming out in October called If This Goes On, edited by Cat Rambo for Parvus Press. This is an anthology that was created in response to recent events, or not so recent events in Charlottesville and other places, and just the general tenor of our times. This is a story which helped break me out of the depression of the last election, which didn't break me out of depression. The depression continues, but that's a whole other matter. But anyway, this is a this anthology will come out in October. Has 30 stories in it by people like Andy Duncan and Sarah Pinsker and Nisi Shaw and other folks, all thinking about these perilous times in which we live and what might happen if they go on. My story is titled, The Stranded Time Traveler Embraces the Inevitable. And as I said, this is a story which I'm very thankful that it came into being because it helped get me back writing again, because I was in a period of time where I was lost. Many of us lost days of writing and weeks of writing after the events of the election. So anyway, I'm glad this story will be in such a good anthology. I'm also pleased that it was a blind submission anthology, those of us who came after the initially announced folks I mentioned, so that means it was read with no name attached. So I'm always pleased when something like that happens and the story is just purchased on its own merit. Not that my name is worth anything, but I'm just glad that it was purchased on its own merits. The stranded time traveler embraces the inevitable. As soon as a stranded time traveler understands where and when he is, he mourns, accepting in a way he never truly had before when listening back in the future as the scientists spouted their theories that he will never see his time again. One reason he's stuck is that he hasn't brought any mechanism for a return trip, as none had yet been invented in those centuries ahead of him, because traveling forward through time, except at the speed of light, was far more hypothetical than traveling in reverse. But another reason is, he'd assumed, he'd hoped that once he had done what was necessary for his present, our tomorrow, to have the future he and his collaborators wished to create, there'd be nothing of the familiar left for him to return to. So what would be the point anyway of machinery designed to bring him back? Then too, there's the fact that though the date of his arrival in the past is tragically closer to his own time than to the intended target from which he's fallen short, maybe the scientist had a theory which would have helped them understand the why of that, but not him. No, he was no scientist. It is not so close ahead that he can live the intervening years to see his time once more through normal means, using that aforementioned form of time travel, which is the only one available to us all. He's already too old for that, and things have gone far too wrong. Even though people live a long time where he comes from in what's our future and in what is now miraculously his own, far longer than people manage to last during the time in which he has become stuck, that lifetime cannot possibly be long enough. If he were to linger for another century to breach the perilous decades about which he knows too much until he reaches the one of his birth, that persistence will still not be enough for him to re-enter the precise time stream he remembers. The time stream he's left behind, the time stream he has lost. Just as well, those scientists who sent him forth, who knew far more about these things than the ones such as him who were chosen to be travelers to create the change to future desires, theorized that such an anomaly of coexistence could be disastrous. Oh, they had lots of theories, didn't they? One reason he'd welcome being sent back was because he'd no longer be forced to listen to them. He tired of their complexities, their inconsistencies. But he'd have been willing to risk it, that overlap with his future self, for a taste of his own time. Surely that coexistence would have been no more of a disaster than what he now faces. His team's one shot at undoing the damage of our time, for firing him back, had taken all the future had, and there was unlikely to be another attempt for years, if at all, has gone awry. Not just by days, but by decades. May of 1927, instead of surrounding him, is long behind him now, in this time's shared past, and the rally at which he was supposed to materialize on a certain day, a certain moment, is unreachable. The arrest he was supposed to witness went unwitnessed. The one he was supposed to have voluntarily endured had been given no chance to occur. He has no purpose now, and his only destiny is to be tortured by time. What was it he's always heard about those not learning from history being doomed to repeat it? Well, he had learned that history, memorized its musty details until it seemed personal, seemed lived, like all those who'd hoped their secretive project would help them avoid it, redirected. And what good has it done him? He's about to repeat history anyway. There's nothing he can do with his learning, his tools, to thwart that. The past he'd been sent to alter is already past. The crisis point on which his whole mission hinged can no longer be changed, for the one whose birth he'd been sent to prevent had already been born. He'd had a very specific plan, one which he'd rehearsed endless times in the unreachable future, so often that he'd even at times found himself rehearsing it in dreams. One punch to get him hauled off with the rest of the crowd, one touch as he sat in the cell beside his target, one simple transfer of genetic material which had been placed within his palm to travel back with him, and the man with whom he was supposed to have been scooped up and taken to jail would be forever sterile. He'd have no son, create no future, well, past turned future for our traveler, president, and the world would be saved. But now it is too late, the son already born, the course already plotted, the destruction already unavoidable. What's done was done, so now there's nothing left for him but to walk the treacherous path beside those he'd been sent to save. Watch as the tenor of the world grows uglier. Wince at the news reports he thought he could help erase. Weep for what he could have undone, but now has no chance of undoing. Success, he knows, could have meant he would have been erased too, or so went another one of the theories spoken to him in urgent tones by those he'd left behind. And yet, he does not care. Forced to live a life he had no idea he'd be expected to live, understanding that he'd soon see the things he values begin to vanish from this world, this time, this past, he knows that's a kind of erasure too, and a much more painful one than the theories anticipated, for it's one he must endure day after day for the rest of his life, as opposed to winking out of existence as a new future was born, which would have happened, or so he'd been told, without him even realizing. That would have been preferable, he thinks. He has not been erased, though, and to survive he works menial jobs, for ones for which he needs no identification. He could become rich, he imagines, with what he knows. Football scores, horse races, election results, especially the one he was taught to believe was surprising, the one he'd failed to undo, only what would be the point? It would change nothing. He can't, no matter how much wealth he might amass, get back further in time to do what he'd been sent to do. And whether he is rich or whether he is poor, it will not be that many more years compared to the number of years he traveled to get here, before the color of his skin and his perceived ethnicity would lead him, along with millions of others, into internment camps. Camps which would not have come to be had he not failed to hit his mark. After a time, trapped as he is, he grows lonely. How could he not, with all he's left behind? And so he allows himself to have a life of sorts. It is not one he would have chosen, but it is one to which he surrenders. If he's going to be forced to endure these times, he's not going to do it alone. He will have a wife, but no, not a family, not a child, for he will not cause to be given to anyone a future, which is no future at all. That would be more selfish than he's willing to admit himself to be, but a wife, though it's not fair to her, he'd go mad without one. He knows that, even though it's a wife to whom he cannot speak the truth, not explain that the reason for their childlessness is because he'd applied what he brought from the future to himself, not feel able, in fact, to explain any part of the future to her at all. But still, a broken life is better than no life at all. He stops reading newspapers or watching the news on TV. What would be the point? He'd read it all, seen it all, forward actually, when he'd readied himself for what was to come. Everyone in his future knew the point at which everything had started to go wrong. Everyone thought nothing could be done about it, except those who banded together in secret to send him back in time. Everyone he disappointed. That disappointment, his own and the future's, fills him with despair, and at times the weight of it makes him think he should end it all and die before he's born. He buys a gun and contemplates doing to himself what the time stream had not. As the weeks pass and he moves closer to taking that action, the thought occurs to him that he could instead turn that weapon on the one who would change the world for the worse, the one who should not have been born, erasing him in a different way than he'd originally planned. But he cannot bring himself to consider that path further. He's not a violent man. Before his trip had begun, he'd made his peace with his part in the undoing. But to kill, even though refraining from killing meant killing the future, was beyond him. And so he circles back around to his original plan and even begins a note to his wife, apologizing for what he had done, would do, but while in the midst of the drafting of it is moved to set it aside and instead write a note of a very different kind. He decides to send a message to the future in which he will explain everything that has happened, everything that has gone wrong, and then he will bury it where he hopes it will be found. Maybe it will be useful to them. Maybe it already has been useful to them. That his notes had not been discovered before he'd been sent back did not mean his work had been a futile message, one destroyed by the passage of time without being received. It can, he hopes, still yet be found in the future. His future, the real future. That's another one of the theories of which he'd had too much. There's no hurry. He takes his time choosing his words and etching them carefully onto metal plates. There are many years between now and then, after all. The day before he intends to head out to the desert, a desert near where the laboratory that launched him would eventually grow, his wife finds that message. He has grown careless, leaving the compartment beneath their bed unlocked. Or perhaps he's unconsciously decided he'd come to love her enough that he wants her to see him as he really is. He looks at her, the woman who will die long before he's born, the ghost whom he loves, he really does, and listens to her questions, uncertain how to answer them. Is he writing science fiction? Is he losing his mind? Is he merely trying to distract himself from a world growing harsher? She's able to answer the last because he's been paying far too much attention to a presidential campaign he's been doing his best to ignore. He has to, for he feels that what is happening is too much his fault, even though it is not. He looks at her in silence for a while, and then, yes, he tells her, and yes, and yes. He comforts her until she sleeps, and then he goes into the desert and buries what he has written, encased in lead, weighted down by concrete, deep under the sand where he knows the construction of a new building had been about to begin when he left. Will anyone find it? Will anyone read it? Will anyone believe it? Use what he had written down to try again, try better? It doesn't matter. There's a cry for help that had to be written. He may never know the effect his words will have, and so the writing of them has to be enough. And then, after having done the one small thing he can, he goes home to his wife and tells her he will write no more. There will be no more distractions. He will ignore the future, ignore the past, pay attention only to the now and to her. Eventually, of course, she dies. He's known that would happen, for even in the past, his life, remember, still ran as long as lives had evolved to be in the future. He feels bad about that most of the time, the losing of her. But sometimes he feels as if it's something he's read in a history book. When they come for him in the years after her death, after the election of the man who should never have been elected, he's prepared because he knew it would happen if he failed to erase what he'd been sent back to erase, if he did not use the touch of his hand, the finger on the trigger. The words preceded the deed, and net a future past in which he swept up. He made sure before they took him to the camp that there would be nothing that mattered to him left behind in the small apartment, empty now even of her, which was exactly how he'd had to deal with his leaving of the future. As he moves through the camp, he once again does his best, encased behind barbed wire, to make a life of sort for himself among people who died before he was born. But he cannot seem to reach them. All those with him move through the place, stunned to be here, and he cannot breach their shock. Yet, how they can be so surprised, how they cannot have seen this coming, he's unable to understand. A person didn't have to be from the future and already know this past that occurred to know. After the election this was inevitable. This and something else. When the war begins, as it surely must, not at all the war the people who put him and the people like him away had lived in fear of, things fall apart quickly. Some of the guards, before they abandon their posts, want to kill them all, but others cut through the fence, taking pity on them and on themselves, and let them run free to make it on their own, as if there's anywhere to run. He wonders, as he wrestles his way to a mountaintop from which he can see the bombs begin to fall, whether his message has gotten through, whether a second time traveler might still do what he himself has failed to do, and if so, whether he'd even know. He imagined he'd wink out of existence without feeling it if another had managed to make it back to succeed where he has not, just as he would have vanished by his own hand had he succeeded. But then he recalled there were other theories recited by the scientists, more comforting theories. The timelines they posited might simply split at the change point, each to proceed along its own path. The stranded time traveler continued to live in a world unchanged, while alongside him, the world he'd left behind would be rescued. Yes, it would be a rescue he'd never get to experience, a rescue he'd never even know to a certainty had occurred, but a rescue nonetheless. And as the light from the mushroom cloud blinds him, he remembers that theory and the promise of that other world, the world in which the things he'd been sent to undo had been undone. And in the space before he burns out of existence, he has just enough time to embrace the concept of an undoing he'll never know, and how that possibility is good enough for him. It will have to be. Thank you. And speaking of stories, as the previous reader, F. Brett Cox said, he wrote a story and he thought that it would not still be relevant. This story seems to have become more relevant since I wrote it a year ago, as I read it. And this will be in, if this goes on, coming from Parvus Press in October, just prior to the midterm elections, edited by Cat Rambo. And I should point out that it was kickstarted, and people who donated at a certain level, what they received for having kickstarted that anthology would be that Colin Coyle, the publisher, was going to stand in front of the White House with a whiteboard holding up whatever message that particular Kickstarter person wanted. 3 people took that particular level. He did put down it had to be something non-threatening, something that will not get him arrested, but sometime between now and the time the book is published, Colin will be standing there with the messages for the people those 3 people who backed the book. So, thank you for listening.
This is the story that got you out of your funk?
This is the story that got me out of my funk.
Good Lord.
Just imagine the stories I write to put me into a funk. Yes. This is how I grappled with the election and began to write again.
At the beginning of the, hopefully he takes a page from the signs that you held up in Washington because they were visible from quite some distance.
Yes.
Also, I don't know if he's as tall as you, but you know, platform shoes.
Any other questions? No, thanks for coming this first night of Readercon. Now that I've cheered you up, go ahead.